Welcome back, everybody. We'd like to begin the session 2 of the 2020 Energy Data Analytics Symposium. My name is Jordan Maloff. I'm an assistant research professor here at Duke University and a co-organizer of the conference. I'll be moderating the next session, which will be focused on energy systems modeling. So I won't talk too long before I turn it over to the experts here for their presentations. At the end of each presentation, we'll do the Q&A, and I'll look for some of the upvoted questions to provide to our presenters. With that, we'll get started with the first presenter. So that'll be Dr. Dylan Harrison-Atlas from the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado. Dylan is a senior data scientist in Geospatial Data Science Group, the Geospatial Data Science Group, as part of NREL's Strategic Energy Analysis Center. So with that, I'd like to invite Dylan to come up onto stage and feel welcome to get started with your presentation, Dylan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dylan Harrison-Atlas. I'm a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Going to spend a couple minutes today talking about research we're actively working on involving surrogate modeling for scalable assessment of wind plant technology innovation. So as background, renewables are a rapidly growing source of energy, and domestically, wind power is projected to account for upwards of 35% of US energy production by 2050. That's up from about 7% currently. So achieving this ambitious growth is going to bring with it a host of challenges. In particular, that type of growth will necessitate an increase in the number of density of wind plants on landscape. And this growth is going to have important implications. One, wind plants are highly sensitive to their layout configuration. So as land becomes increasingly constrained, it's important to understand what those trade-offs are and where plants can be deployed alongside other land use considerations that include social and ecological objectives. So balancing the spatial footprint becomes a really interesting question, particularly as the penetration of wind power grows. In addition, this growth could entail expansion into new regions of the country where we don't currently see wind power deployment. And so it raises the question, what are the opportunities for technology innovation in the space, and how might they either improve or hinder this expansion of wind power into the future? Another challenge is that existing models for estimating wind power production, at least those that are high fidelity models, tend to be designed for site-specific analyses. They're computationally quite burdensome. Their accuracies can be great, but they're not well suited for national scale analysis. And therefore, they may not be able to answer these types of questions that, again, are becoming increasingly important over time. And so there's a need for flexible, efficient methods that are capable of scalable analysis. In particular, when we think about wind plants, their design characteristics really matter for plant production. This affects not only cost and economics, but also, again, these other considerations about how much land a wind farm might take up and how this factors into their performance. In particular, wind turbines are subject to inefficiencies that can result from wake losses. So wake losses refer to the loss in potential wind power production that results from the extraction of energy from the wind by a turbine. So if there's a turbine that's located directly downstream of another turbine, depending on the speed that wind is incoming, it could potentially result in loss of production to the downwind turbine. And so to address those concerns, a technology innovation that's referred to as wake steering has been proposed as a potential solution. Wake steering involves the use of yaw optimization, which at a very high level, if you think about a turbine that's facing the wind, if you rotate the rotor of that turbine, you can actually control which way the downwind wake goes. And you can adjust those in order to optimize for the production of a wind plant. And so wake steering is this technology innovation that's on the horizon that's really exciting because it could potentially improve the profitability and efficiency of wind plants while also minimizing or reducing how much land they need to take up. So it's an important consideration. The challenge is that although this technology has been demonstrated with some higher fidelity physics-based models and also with a few field experiments, those benefits have really been limited to specific sites and under certain conditions. And so achieving a broader understanding of the opportunities and also land use implications of this technology is currently limited by the methods that we have available because they're so expensive to run, even for a particular layout for a particular site. Therefore, there's a need for more efficient models, and that brings us to surrogate modeling. So there are a number of research objectives that I'd like to address today. The first is, how do you construct a surrogate model for wind power applications, and what is it? The second is moving into two national scale case studies. The first is looking at what are the annual energy production or AEP benefits of this wake steering technology across geographies, and how significant are they? And then also, how can we use this technology potentially to reduce wind power's footprint as wind becomes more prevalent across the landscape? So in order to address this problem, we simplified the way we think about wind plants. Wind plants can vary in terms of turbine technology, as well as spacing of the turbines on the landscape. Here we fix the turbine technology and we focus on looking at the impact of different layouts. And so we assume for this analysis that we're looking at a 170 megawatt wind plant, which is about on par with what we're seeing for modern day land-based wind plants. This wind plant is comprised of 50 turbines that are arranged in terms of 5 rows and 10 columns. Now, within those constraints, though, we permute the design characteristics to look at a whole possible subset of arbitrary layouts that could occur, again, within this hypothetical wind plant. And so we are able to iterate using Latin hypercube sampling across these parameters that describe the column-wise spacing, the row-wise spacing between turbines, how misaligned rows are, and also the rotation of the entire farm relative to the predominant wind direction. And as we can see in the upper right, this produces a very rich set of layout distribution that we can then sample from and use to learn about how generalizable benefits of wake steering technology innovation might actually be. So to answer this question, we start off with the premise that it's not really feasible to do this, at least for national scale analysis, using any current traditional methodologies. And so there's a need for surrogate modeling. And surrogate modeling, just think of it as an efficient mapping between a set of inputs and an output that's predicted by a much more sophisticated, expensive model. So in this case, the more expensive model is NREL's open source flow redirection and indirection steady state model, or FLORIS. FLORIS can take a set of input parameters that we described in the earlier slide that pertain to the spacing of these turbines, and it can produce as an output this response surface. So the response surface tells us for any given wind plant layout and technology configuration, how much power would be expected for this range of inflow conditions. So you can think of each pixel within this surface as a particular inflow condition that represents a wind direction in a wind speed. Output that's predicted is, again, specific to a particular layout. What's interesting about this approach is that if we focus on the response surface, we can apply that response surface universally to all locations across the country, and then we can essentially update how that response surface would translate into a site-specific estimate of energy production by bringing in information about the wind resource and the probability of those different inflow conditions at each site. So what we do here is we multiply the response surface by this probability density describing the inflow conditions, and that gives us an estimate of the annual energy production that's specific to a site for a particular layout. And so our response surface workflow, again, is to take these input parameters, feed them into this Flores model, generate a response surface, and then we train the surrogate model so that it can predict these response surfaces as a function of these input parameters. So we observed when looking at the response surface that it has these spatial characteristics. So if you look at the response surface on the bottom left, its dimensionality, it's got 21 wind speeds and 72 wind directions. And we can see that there are troughs there. So although there's largely a vertical gradient in terms of the power that's produced at higher output, we see that because of these wake effects, we get troughs in the response surface. And so it's these troughs that we really want to capture. And therefore, we ended up formulating this problem as an image-to-image translation issue, where our target variable was this response surface. And we ended up stacking up our input parameters as channels in a multi-channel image. So the image accounts for wind speed, wind direction in each of these layout parameters, and our goal is to produce this response surface. Details of the neural net architecture are shown on the right. I'll kind of skip the details on that for now. I think the important point is that we trained two models here. One is for no controls. The other is for this wake steering case that uses yaw optimization. Again, wake steering intentionally misaligns rotors so that we minimize the effects of waking in terms of energy production. Computing this yaw optimization, even with an efficient model like Flores, is quite costly, and you can see that there's some big numbers there. So we had to parallelize these across our energy efficient supercomputer to generate these robust training samples. So the model does well when evaluated against test data, at least measured using mean absolute error and MSE. If we look on the right side, we see what the surrogate model predicts for a response surface in the upper left of each panel compared to the upper right, which is what the full form model would predict. The residuals look pretty good. In some cases, we miss troughs, but for the most part, we capture those waking effects. So if we apply these trained surrogate models to the national scale, we can focus on two hypothetical layouts here, layout A, layout B. You can see the differences in the parameters. What's interesting here is that when we compare the energy production for these two layouts and look at the gains that are associated strictly with implementing this wake steering technology, we see that the benefits are largely confined to regions with moderate wind resource quality. Again, that's expected. There's less of a need for wake steering in regions that have really high wind because that waking is less of an issue in terms of net power production. What's interesting, though, is if we focus on layout B, the gains tend to be most significant in regions where there's currently limited deployment of wind power. And so if we focus on the southeast, again, we see that the wind regions, wind resources in this part of the country are more moderate. And so it suggests that this technology may be an opportunity for wind to expand again to other regions. For those of you that are less familiar with the wind power domain specifically, AEP gains, and AEP again is annual energy production of 4%, are actually quite significant. This can make or break the profitability and the economics of a wind plant. So depending on other factors, improvements of 2 to 4% are quite significant. They're also in line with what we might expect based on the literature. So demonstrating the viability of the surrogate model for a second case study, we can get at this question for how does performance of wind plants decline as a function of turbine spacing? So on the x-axis, we have capacity density here. Just think of this in terms of how closely are you packing together turbines on the landscape. Typically, what you would expect is that as turbines get closer together, you have greater wake effects, therefore you have greater efficiencies, and you have lower performance that's measured here in the y-axis by this capacity factor. And that's what you see with the no controls case that are shown there in blue. here we focus on 6 sites across the country. You can see the wind resource is variable for each of these locations as shown by the wind rows. In all cases though, the yaw optimization controls improve performance in that we see that there's less of a gradient as we increase the density and therefore land use efficiency of these wind plants. So quickly, if we focus only on this trade-off curve for yaw optimization, the beauty of the surrogate modeling approach is that we can then take this analysis and then apply it to the whole country. And so if we want to quantify this trade-off in terms of looking at the slope of the relationship between capacity density and capacity factor, surrogate models give us an opportunity to do that. So on the left-hand side, we have a map that essentially shows that regression coefficient. So this is the slope of the relationship between capacity density and capacity factor. It shows us how plant performance varies as a function of capacity density. What's interesting is that the areas that are shown here in darker green have a lower slope, which means that there's less of a trade-off, which means in these parts of the country, you can pack turbines together more closely, plants can be more dense, but there's less of a downside in terms of how you're going to reduce your annual energy production for those sites. These sites, again, tend to align with areas that have higher wind resource, which is good validation because that aligns with expectations for this technology as well. If we look at the question of, okay, well, how well does capacity density actually explain variation in plant performance? The map on the right-hand side shows that it does pretty well, at least according to this R-squared metric. So in conclusion, robustly trained models can inform a wide range of applications. Here we focused on a couple, but we've shown that this wake steering technology can improve performance in ways that not only enable greater land use efficiency, but also the competitiveness of regions that historically have not been developed for wind power. These are some interesting findings. The development of trained data sets may be costly. You probably noted the large numbers there that were associated with the computations required to generate these trained data sets. It's an interesting problem because the motivation for surrogate modeling is typically because the full form model is too expensive to run for whatever analysis you're interested in. But we've identified additional opportunities to reduce costs down the road. And also note that that cost of developing the training data set is really a one-time cost. So once you've developed the surrogate model and it's robustly informed, then it all offers a number of other benefits, including once trained, near instantaneous evaluation. So predictions can be done on the fly. Analytical gradients of models can be used for a variety of applications as well. And I think the most important thing about the surrogate model is that they can offer insights across broad parameter space and for really a wide range of design scenarios, and that these types of analyses are simply not feasible or tractable using traditional approaches just because they're way too expensive to implement and again, are typically focused on a single site. So I will conclude with that, but thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Dylan. That was awesome. For some of you may know, but probably most don't. Yeah, Dylan and I work together on some other projects, and I wasn't aware of some of the other very interesting work you're doing. This is very much in my wheelhouse too, using neural networks to replace everything else in the universe.
Yep.
So
when it works, it works.
That's right. That's right. So we'll turn it over to Q&A now. Again, we have about 5 minutes, and I'd encourage folks to put any questions they have in the Q&A tab. We've got a couple coming in. I'll turn to the first one here. So Dylan, do you see this technique as being most useful for wind farm planning or operations, or maybe both?
That's a great question. I would say as it's currently implemented, more so for planning, for sure. I think this was designed to be, again, relevant to a broad range of conditions, and also for a range of input parameters, although we did have to make some simplifying assumptions about, again, the size of the farm and other specifics about the layout. So in order to get this relevant for operational uses, you would have to construct one, I think that would be flexible enough or specific to the conditions at a particular site. Again, I think that gets away from some of the motivations of a surrogate model. If you have a very specific kind of limited set of conditions that you want to evaluate, it probably makes more sense to use the full form model. But I think the opportunities for surrogate modeling increase and become more viable as you're kind of in that exploratory space when you want to look at trade-offs or performance across a broad range of conditions.
So actually, if I can just elaborate on that question a little bit. So once you have the surrogate model, this can run really quickly, and you can you could imagine doing in real time, checking, I guess, the optimality of your settings in the wind farm. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could potentially do that. Again, it would just depend on the training data that's been supplied to it, right? Mm-hmm. So this particular model would be limited to wind farms that adhere to 170 megawatts capacity and have turbines in this particular number of rows and columns.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But it's not to say that you couldn't develop something similar, but for a more specific use case.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. So turning back to the Q&A tab here. Okay, so did this work reveal any interesting findings? For example, arrangements of turbines that you would have assumed would have performed one way, but your model predicted it would perform differently? Yeah,
great question. Yeah, I think what was interesting and part of the interpretation was that last piece where I was showing essentially the trade-off between plant performance and capacity density. And capacity density is a commonly used metric when describing wind plant footprints. So just as additional context, wind plants over the last decade or so have been getting larger and larger, and therefore this land use question has really emerged as an important topic. And so capacity density is like a common metric for assessing that. It actually turns out that it's more complicated than that, because it's less so about capacity density per se and more really about the density of turbines relative to like a wind direction. And so that's why in that first case study I showed, I think layout B actually tended to outperform layout A in most locations, even though layout B, I think, had lower like overall density. It's actually the density and the spacing of turbines that align with the prevailing wind direction. But that relationship is also a function of the wind resources at a site. Because some sites you have wind coming from one direction all the time, right? And then it matters less about spacing in other directions. But for other sites where you have a more uniform wind rows, where wind can blow from any direction, and that energy is kind of distributed around the compass, then spacing both in the DX and DY direction matters more. So I think that was kind of an interesting insight and validation as well.
That's all. Thank Dylan. I know we can't hear that here. There's no emojis, but thanks, Dylan. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.